Hello, my name is Lilian Sims, and I'm a first year PhD student at the University of Cincinnati, where Dr. Helen Meyer is my advisor. Today, I will be sharing with you how we use trade books to teach nature of science and how I am interested in diverging from this action research project to look more closely at how I can use trade books to teach cultural relevance. So I am also a secondary science teacher in Cincinnati Public Schools. And I've worked with Dr. Meyer and Randy Gibson in science methods at University of Cincinnati, where we are doing this action research project where we're looking at innovative teaching strategies. About 3 years ago, we thought about how we could teach nature of science differently, where it could be more engaging for students, and we could model some strategies that the pre-service teachers could use themselves to teach the nature of science in their classrooms. So we decided to incorporate trade books as a part of our teaching strategies. And it started with using straight trade books for students to reflect on what they learned about nature of science and socio-scientific issues. And we have built on that reflection to this point to an action research project. So today, what I will be doing is I'll be sharing my thoughts and my ideas, and I'm hoping to engage this scholarly community early in the process as I try to diverge into a separate action research project. So I'm seeking the input from a range of expertise, and I'm hoping to leverage this opportunity to learn from you about resources and strategies that I could use to diverge into a separate action research project. So here's an overview of the project that we have done so far. We started with cohort one and we read the trade book, The Ghost Map. We included with that some general class discussions after each section of the book, and we focused on history and the nature of science, but there was no capstone nor group project related to that particular trade book. And then in the fall of 2019, we read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And let me back up to say this is all as a part of science methods courses. So in the fall of 2018 and the fall of 2019, we actually use intermediate methods course where we use these strategies. So in the fall of 2019, we read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, where we completed literature circles and we focused on socioeconomic issues, very much like we did cohort one. But one thing we did differently was we had students to do small group presentations where they were assigned a particular focus. Then on the spring of 2020, we worked with a third cohort where they also read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This was the introductory methods course. So this would be their first methods course. So we found that this book would be a little bit easier for them, we thought. So these students actually completed point of view inventories and moral surveys. They also completed literature circles that focused on ethics and as well as socio-scientific issues and ethics. One thing we did differently with this group was we added a structured problem-based learning activity where we collaborated with teachers in a local school district to develop the template for that, and we had students to use that as a part of this project. And then in the fall of 2020, with the same cohort, we had them to read the biographies of scientists, where they focused on the history of nature of science and the clashing of ideas. So students worked in pairs to create graphic novels and to collaboratively plan problem-based learning units. And one of the reasons we're focusing on problem-based learning units is because some of the school districts, particularly, they use problem-based learning as their primary framework. And so we wanted students to be able to do that as well. So what we wanted students to learn using these innovative strategies is we really wanted to focus on the nature of science in terms of the history and context. We also wanted to focus on socio-scientific issues. So those were the things that we primarily wanted them to learn about science. As it relates to teaching, We wanted to incorporate the use of trade books in instructions, and so we could model for secondary science teachers how they could do it as well. We did that because we wanted to promote literacy in two ways. First of all, we wanted to promote scientific literacy with this focus on the nature of science and socio-scientific issues. But we also wanted to promote traditional literacy. As students, many students will be working on urban schools, and in Cincinnati public schools particularly, that is one of the district initiatives that all of the courses and all of the disciplinary areas focus on traditional literacy. We also want to implement problem-based learning strategies. So we wanted students to learn that as a part of their teaching as well. So we use trade books because we know that pre-service teachers need more training in the nature of science. That's the case, quite honestly, for some in-service teachers too. We know that they have a minimal exposure to history of science when they come into the methods courses. And we thought that they could learn about the nature of science in historical and a cultural context. And so generally, pre-service teachers, very much like secondary students, found trade books to be more engaging than traditional textbooks. So one of the books we used was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And that's a book that I am going to be focusing on because there are some observations and some learnings that I had as I engaged with students in literature circles and some of the strategies we used in class. So we focused on this book because it is familiar and it's accessible in many ways. It's available at the library. We have copies of the book at our university. The book is available also in audio form, so it's accessible in a variety of ways. This book also addresses issues of race, poverty, and privilege in the development of science and in scientific research. We also thought that this book would be more easily connected to science today and that it would align with most high school biology curriculums. And we realized that students may have read it in English or advanced science courses. So some of the primary strategies that we used in instruction were planning templates that, particularly for problem-based learning, that we collaborated with local schools to help develop, and we posted the plans for them for students to see. We also use literature circles where we model discussions of readings to help build reading strategies. We also use very explicit reading strategies, again, with the rationale of helping teachers to learn to implement and use strategies to build literacy in their classrooms. We also use pre and post surveys and student reflections to address their ideas about the nature of science, ethics, and values related to the practice of science. We had some expected outcomes as we use these strategies. We expect the students to learn the strategies that they themselves would be able to implement in their classrooms, particularly with the use of trade books to teach the nature of science as well as socio-scientific issues. We wanted the students themselves to demonstrate their understanding of socio-scientific issues related to the books. And finally, we wanted them to develop a response in the form of a Model UN resolution. So we provided students with rubrics and criteria about how they would develop the Model UN. As we were going through some of these strategies, particularly in the use of literature circles, I started to see students' perspectives about the impact of scientific research on African American families. And I started to wonder how I could help students to think more critically and how I could help them to engage in more culturally relevant strategies to help them think more critically about these issues. I also observed students' perspectives about the development of mistrust in communities of colors, and in some cases, the absence of the perspective about the development of mistrust in communities of color, and saw that as an opportunity too to help students to think more critically about culturally relevant issues. I saw students' perspectives about women's issues that were raised in the book about Henrietta Lacks, particularly issues related to women's health. And so I saw all of these as opportunities to connect to cultural issues in urban schools. We have many of our pre-service teachers who are placed in urban schools, and I myself work in urban school. So I saw this as an opportunity to learn more about cultural issues in these urban schools in hopes that they can make greater connections with their own students. I also saw perspectives about issues related to students' populations in their schools, and saw opportunities for students to think more critically about that and make greater connections to that as well. So, having seen this, for me, this was an opportunity for me to diverge from the focus of nature of science using trade books to a focus on cultural relevance as we talked about these trade books. And my motivation for the divergence was hearing and reading students' reflections. It was also knowing that science teachers need more training and resources in cultural relevance. Having been trained as a teacher evaluator, I know that cultural relevance is one of the things that teachers are evaluated, particularly in our district. So I'm looking for opportunities myself about how I can help my colleagues and pre-service teachers develop and identify research sources for cultural relevance. I also recognized in the story of Henrietta Lacks that that was a real life story with real consequences to which urban students can connect. So I also that also supported my decision to diverge from focusing on nature of science to focusing on cultural relevance. And also, my motivation is based on the Henrietta Lacks story, which is a basis for mistrust in the African American community in terms of healthcare and research. And I wanted to make sure that students understood that as they read the book and can make a connection to that as well. So, moving forward, I had two questions that I wanted to focus on in action research. And one is, what strategies can I use to develop or promote cultural relevance for prospective teachers in urban schools? And how can I help students think more critically about the intersectionality of race, gender, and social class? And what I would expect to be the outcomes for this action based research would be students would think more critically. Also, I would like for them to think more critically about nature of science. I don't want that to leave, but I do want the focus to be on implementing culturally relevant practices in their science instruction. And also like the outcome to be them exploring the intersectionality of race, gender, and socioeconomic status, as well as implementing strategies for promoting traditional literacy as well as scientific literacy. So these are the resources that I use for my presentation today. So I look forward to your feedback and your input. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.